Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bahia Simons-Lane, and I'm the Executive Director of USJETAA, the US JET Program Alumni Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to further US-Japan relations by supporting alumni of the JET program. I was a JET in Gunma Prefecture from 2005 to 2007, and I'm very excited to welcome today Emily Frank, who is a JET alumna and professional career counselor. Before we get into the webinar, there's a few things I'd like to mention. We do have an upcoming program that I'd like to let you all know about. The call for submissions are now open for our Japan Matters for America program. This is a partnership between USJETAA and the East-West Center in Washington that allows JET alumni to submit short abstracts to write articles on US-Japan related issues. We focus on people-to-people connections between the United States and Japan at the state and local levels, and selected applicants will be writing a full-length article for the Japan Matters for America website. Please check out usjetaa.org for more information. The submission deadline is May 15th. I would also like to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars. This Thursday, we have two webinars, one at 2 p.m. and one at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time for JET alumni chapter leaders focusing on JETAA during this time of COVID. Those are not really relevant to individual JET alumni, but if you're a leader for a JETAA chapter, you may find it a very useful discussion to take to participate in. We also have two upcoming webinars in May. One is on personal branding with Amelia Hagen, which is on May 14th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And we have one on May 27th with Ryan Paw on marketing your JET experience. We haven't officially announced registration for those, but that will be coming soon. So please check our website, usjetaa.org, or our social media to find out more information. And lastly, if you are a JET alumni and you are on this webinar today and you're not yet a member of USJETAA, please go to usjetaa.org and become a member. We would love to have you. Now, Emily, if you could go to the next slide, there's just some very brief housekeeping on how all of this works. I know we're all getting very familiar with technical platforms these days, but today we will be taking questions only via chat. We will be using the Q&A feature, which will be at the bottom of your screen. If you're on mobile, it'll be on the bottom of your screen as well, but you will have to tap or click on the screen to get that to pop up. So if you have any questions, we will be taking those at the end, but you may ask them at any time. Please type them into the Q&A feature so that we know what questions to prepare for. Lastly, we are recording, so please keep that in mind. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Emily.
All right. Hi, everyone. Here's me in real life, or me now, as opposed to me right out of college. So I'm so glad you all could join in the call today. By way of background, I want to tell you a little bit about me. So as Bahia mentioned, I am also a JET. I was in Hokkaido a really long time ago, and I have been a career counselor. I actually need to update this slide. I've been a career counselor for over 13 years now, and I worked with lots and lots of JET alums kind of in your situation, although not under these particular circumstances. So I hope to give you some really good information, get you answer some of your questions, all of that good stuff. So to start off, I just want to acknowledge how weird these times are. Everyone's kind of freaked out. People are kind of going through mass trauma, and for many of us, that is the first time. And there have been loads and loads of layoffs and furloughs. And there's confusion about even as simple an idea as layoffs and furloughs. What's the difference between them? What does it mean if you have been furloughed? What does it mean if you've been partially furloughed? Can you apply for unemployment? All those kinds of crazy things. And so I know that people have a lot of questions, and I wanted to give you a few tips to kind of get through this temporary but weird new normal. So if you all are working from home, here are some kind of basic tips. These are things that are really scientifically vetted, but I will say that, of course, everything is pretty individual. But according to all of the research on working from home, a few things that you can do to make yourself a little bit more effective would be to develop some habits so that your work really feels like work. You know, actually set your alarm, wake up to it as much as you do when you're actually going into an office. Have something that you do instead of a commute. Normally I will walk my dog first thing in the morning, but it's bitterly cold here today and snowy, and my dog is 5.5 pounds, so she wants no part of it. So I did not walk her today, but something that feels like a routine, so that you really kind of are in that work mindset, if you will. And then really, it seems really simple, but try to get dressed. And it doesn't have to be as formal as you might dress yourself if you were going into an office, but it feels a lot more productive if you actually put on regular clothes instead of just kind of hanging out in your PJs all day. I will say that I've been opting for more comfortable bottom end clothing, so I'm going a little bit more for sweats than I am for regular slacks or jeans, but do get dressed. It's going to make you feel a little bit better and more like you are really doing some work. So you're also going to want to dedicate a workspace. This amuses me here because this is actually my workspace here at home. It's my table, my little work table in the kitchen, and you can see kind of over the top of my computer screen the edge of my rice cooker. I do have my laptop set up on a cooling rack because I've been doing a lot of video and it keeps heating up. But have some kind of dedicated workspace, just something that feels like work to you, and that's going to help you stay a little bit more focused on the tasks of work as opposed to all of the other things that might demand your attention at home, especially if some of those things are, you know, snacks or television. And that's honestly part of why I've set my workspace up in my kitchen. I really wanted to be away from the television, so I wasn't too tempted just to kind of zone out and binge watch a bunch of stuff that I'm not that interested in. Another thing you can do is really use a calendar. And even if you're not in the habit of using a calendar, you might think about starting one now, but you're going to want to be very specific with your calendar. So don't put in, you know, LinkedIn, but put in, you know, read through my current LinkedIn profile. You're going to have very discrete and specified tasks for yourself so that you can kind of keep on task, but also so that you can make sure that you are doing kind of small steps at a time. Don't skip lunch. It's really easy, I think, to get into a zone of work and forget about normal things. So make sure that you're also, especially on your calendar, scheduling times for you to do things like eat lunch. You're also going to want to figure out such things as when you are most productive. So I know I've said to set your alarm. These slides, this is a clickable link here. So you can, when you get this PowerPoint, you can also click on that link. There's a really good resource that's just kind of an experiment for you to figure out when your most productive time of the day is. And if you're really struggling to focus, as a lot of us are, I'm going to suggest that you try one of those apps like the Pomodoro technique, which is shorter bursts of productivity. And there are lots of free timers you can find online that'll walk you through the process of doing it. But it's easier, I think, to focus in those shorter bursts than to really kind of feel like you have to be normally productive. And then, of course, what I really want to encourage you all to do is to take a lot of breaks. We're all stressed out. We're all kind of anxious. Everyone is kind of dealing with this whole big weird thing. And what you're going to find is that it's going to be harder. And so the pieces that you are normally find really easy to do are going to feel a lot harder. And so even kind of regular mundane tasks like answering a handful of emails may wind up just taking a whole lot out of you. So be sure that you're scheduling yourself for lots and lots of breaks. And you can do kind of whatever feels good during those breaks. Today I'm kind of walking up and down indoors because it's so cold out, but you can also just like take a quick walk around the block, do some stretches, spend 10 or 15 minutes playing an online game, whatever feels kind of good and relaxing to you, because these are hard times. Now, I also want to be sure to talk to you about what to do if you're looking for work, because as I mentioned, so many people have been laid off or furloughed. if you have been furloughed, what that tends to mean is that there is a job waiting for you when things get back to normal, normal in quotation marks, because what we're finding, of course, is that even in places where people are returning to work, which is beginning to happen in China, people are still doing it in shifts. So it's not going to be normal, but there might be times when you can go back to work if you are furloughed. Until then, if you really just need to make some more money, you can look at resources like Flex Jobs and Side Hustle, which are places that you can go for temporary work or side gigs. Obviously, Side Hustle is a side gig kind of organization, but that can really help to kind of make ends meet a little bit. And, you know, the news keeps being that our stimulus checks are coming. I have not seen mine yet. So really be kind of mindful of some things you can do to make ends meet, but also know that there absolutely are employers that are still hiring. What you'll find is that a lot of the jobs that are out there are not necessarily the kinds of things you want to have as career paths. They're going to be things like delivery work in grocery stores, things like that, where people are really needing a lot of extra help. But if you are really in kind of a dire financial situation, you can definitely look at that and just see if there's something that you can stand the idea of doing shorter term. And Side Hustle also has a lot of jobs that are in fact remote. So that's kind of a nice piece if you just wanted to do some editing of documents, maybe help people create Facebook ads for themselves, those kinds of things. Flex Jobs is, as it says, just kind of very much focused on those flexible work from home kinds of jobs, and that can be a really useful piece. But here's the thing. Even now, even when it feels like nobody's hiring, even when everyone's really freaked out, what I really want to encourage you all to do is really be networking. And I know it feels odd because it's not like you're going out and meeting people for coffee, but you really can and should still be networking, again, within reason. And so don't put unrealistic expectations out there. This isn't going to look like what it looks like when you are in your normal life, but you absolutely can still network. And what I recommend starting with is people who are already somehow in your circle. So that could be your college roommate, your aunt, your best friend from high school, people like that. And certainly you can reach out to other Jets. What you'll find, I think, with this group is that it tends to be a fairly receptive group of people. But there is a little caveat there. People who are working right now are tending to be working a ton. So it's kind of broken us down into two camps. So there are people who have a lot of leisure time and people who feel like they have almost none. And so if you reach out to someone who is still working, your response from that person may be delayed. On the other side, if you reach out to someone who has a little bit too much spare time on their hands, you might either get a really quick response or you'll get kind of a half-hearted response because they're having trouble focusing. So give people a little bit of extra space as you go through this. But what I really recommend that you do is you ask folks for an informational interview. An informational interview is what it sounds like. If you have been in a session with me before, you have heard me say this. So really all you're gonna do is you're gonna reach out to people and you're gonna say, hey, so what you do looks really interesting. And with this extra time I have on my hands, I'm really just kind of curious about it. Do you have half an hour or so for a quick Zoom chat or a phone call, whatever works for you, FaceTime? I'd really like to hear more about your job and what you're doing. And then you're going to jot down the questions that you really want to be sure you ask each person, although you're going to let it be a free-flowing conversation, but there are definitely going to be pieces of that person's job that you have very particular questions about. So write those down so you remember them. And then at the end of these sessions, you're going to do two things. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to ask who else they know that you can reach out to. So you begin to build your network one person at a time. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to ask them their favorite local coffee shop so that if possible, you can send them a very small, like a $5 or $10 gift card to thank them for their time, but that also supports local businesses because as we all know, those guys are struggling now. When you ask for an additional contact, I recommend you be very specific. Don't just say, who else can you talk to, but say, hey, XYZ part of this sounded really interesting to me. Do you know someone else I can talk to who does that? And figure out kind of logistically how it's going to work. I recommend that if possible, you get the person's full name and contact information in case your contact forgets or gets overwhelmed with things and just doesn't somehow introduce you, but an introduction is also fine. So I talked about informational interviews already. These are normally things that you can do with people over coffee, which is really nice because you get that kind of warm human connection with it. Obviously, that's not happening these days, but the nice thing about the informational interview is that it is pretty informal. And so you can ask things that you wouldn't ordinarily ask in, say, a regular interview. So that could include things like the salary ranges and how flexible the work is, and if there are things that that particular individual actually dislikes about the work. And you're likely to get a more honest answer, for one, because people are now physically distanced from their work, but also because they're really in the mode of giving you information. And so people will say things like, you know, when I was, let's say, a new ESL teacher, I really struggled because it wasn't like when I was teaching in Japan, and I had a whole lot of responsibility, and I didn't feel very confident about how to use technology in my classroom. It probably took me 2 years to get comfortable. Now what I really enjoy about my job is knowing I'm making a difference in kids' lives, something like that, right? So, you know, you can ask very specific questions, and you can be fairly nosy in these informational interviews in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily. Typically, you're aiming for that sort of 30-minute mark. But it's going to depend a lot on your schedule and the schedule of the people that you are talking to. But ask for 30 minutes. Most people feel like that is something that they can give. Now, a note of caution. Many of you have run afoul already of applicant tracking systems. You should know, you can know that that's happened to you because you will send off resumes and not hear anything. You might get a thank you for your application and then nothing else. So, applicant tracking systems are a fairly big deal in certain industries right now. And those tend to be kind of larger segments. So you'll get them a lot in things like higher ed, government positions, and very large corporations. And what they are is basically bots that are designed to weed out applicants who aren't qualified for the job. But they're not that smart. And so they do it by looking for keywords. And they also look for very key formatting elements. So I'm telling folks a lot of very specific things around resume design these days. And I'll outline a few of them here for you all today, just so you have kind of a basic sense of it. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to have a pretty straightforward format to your document. Which means no headers, no footers, no columns, no photos of yourself, no photos of anything, really very kind of basic, straightforward design. And ideally, you're going to want to have it in a format that everyone can read. So that's going to be something like Word or a Google Doc. And I used to tell people all the time to convert it to PDF and send it out. And now I'm telling people with the applicant tracking systems, only do that if they specifically say that a PDF is acceptable, because some of the systems can't read them. And so in that case, you're going to want to send it in as a Word document or as a Google Doc. So really go very, very simple with it. Have some piece of a physical address on your resume. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, but you'll want at a minimum city, state, zip, so that the bots recognize you as an actual person and are going to kind of pass you through to the next level. And then you're also going to want to make sure that your resume is really hitting the keywords, but we little humans are very fallible when it comes to deciphering keywords. So what I really recommend is that you go to a site like JobScan here to figure out what the keywords are. JobScan is free, and you can do up to, I believe, 5 scans in a month, but there is a lifetime cutoff point. It's something like 30, maybe 40. And so the problem then becomes, if you are running a lot of resumes through it, you're going to cap out. And so if that happens, have another email address ready so that you can have a new account. But the other thing is, if you paste your resume in, what it's going to do is compare your resume in the job description, and it's going to give you a percentage. So it'll say like a 44% match, and then it'll walk through and tell you the specific phrases and keywords that you're missing. So you can go back and put them in, but then you can rescan it, and it doesn't count against your initial group of scans. So just so you know, it's a really helpful link that's out there. And that is the high points of what I had to say to you all today. There's plenty more that I could talk about, but I wanted to be sure to leave a lot of time for your questions and just kind of any specific resources that you all feel like you might need. So Bahia, do you want to read the questions, or would you prefer if I just go in and find them here from the chat?
Well, so far we've had a few questions that were not really specific to the content of what we're talking about today. But for those of you who are listening in, please ask your questions in the Q&A so that we can answer them. Now, I do have a few questions myself, things that came to mind as I was listening to you. So in terms of your informational interview, what platforms do you recommend using for those? Should you use something that provides some kind of video, or is doing it by phone? What is preferred?
Yeah, excellent question. I recommend something that has a video option because we feel at this point a little bit disconnected from each other. And it's nice to get even the little piece of another human being that you see in a video option. But I will give a little caveat there, which is that a lot of us, I know, Bahia and I were talking about this earlier, a lot of us are struggling with internet issues. It's storming where she is and it's snowing where I am. And so sometimes our internet connections go out. So I would recommend that you begin the conversation on something like Zoom or FaceTime. If you have access to GoToMeeting, that's fine as well. But have a backup plan that's just each other's phone numbers in case the internet kind of poops out on you. But this kind of FaceTime that you can have with people, I think is really, really valuable and makes us feel a little bit less disconnected from the rest of the world. Now take good notes though, that's the other thing, because when you're only seeing this much of a person, it takes your brain twice as much energy to process the information. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a notepad and you're taking very thorough notes when you're talking to someone.
Thanks, Emily. And those of you listening in, if you're having any trouble using the Q&A feature, you can also type your question into the chat. I have a follow-up question about this type of networking and connections. Could you talk a little bit more about how to connect with people using LinkedIn?
Sure, yeah, it's an excellent question. So there are a few really cool things you can do on LinkedIn. One of them is once you have hit a certain number of connections, you can actually just take advantage of LinkedIn's algorithms, which actually will begin to suggest people for you to connect with. So for example, if you have connected with a lot of people who have JET listed in their experience, the algorithms are gonna start kind of making those connections and recommending other JETs for you to connect to. But then also, if you have listed your university in your profile, then if you go to the primary university webpage and hit alumni, it's the very bottom option for your school's page. It's going to tell you other people who have the university listed on their page, and you can connect really easily with other alumni that way. And then of course you can also just search. There's a people search you can do. There's also a job search. And so I recommend that people kind of go in and really think about what's interesting, what they like, what they want to be doing next when this is all over, and look for people doing that, or look for people who work at a particular organization and connect with them that way. I had a client once who, for various reasons, really wanted to work at Disney, but was not an artist, wanted to work more on, I think, the HR side of things, and was really struggling to find connections. So I went to my alumni network from undergrad and looked up people who might be at Disney, and I found someone in AR at Disney, and I reached out and I said, hey, I'm looking for someone in human resources. Do you have a connection there? And I connected my person with that person, and together they found a human resources person at Disney that my client could talk to. So you want to get a little bit creative, but definitely check out those alumni links and look for other people you know who are on JET when you were there as well. You should also be able to do a search for JET program. And then of course, USJETAA has a really cool feature. This is not LinkedIn, but USJETAA also has a directory that you can get listed in. I'm in it. It's a really neat resource, and it's another way you can connect with people, although it's not LinkedIn.
Thanks, Emily. And something else I would add, I get contacted a lot on LinkedIn or get requests for connections. And I definitely, sometimes I get people and I'm not really sure why they are contacting me. Maybe there's somebody I don't think I've met in person, or I see that they're, especially if they were not a JET, I accept every connection request from somebody who has JET program listed in their LinkedIn profile. So that's a really, really good thing to do to kind of plug into that network. But definitely if you're reaching out to somebody or getting connected to somebody and you haven't just met them or just spoke to them, please leave a message, a note with that. I think that really helps.
Yeah, and be specific. I got an invitation today that said something like, I'm looking to connect with professionals on LinkedIn. My motivation to accept that person is not that high. Good for you, looking to connect with professionals on LinkedIn, which is the thing LinkedIn does. So make a specific request too. So you're gonna say something more like, I'm looking to connect with banking professionals or whatever. So you're actually asking for a particular thing and people understand, as Bahia said, why you're reaching out to them.
Great. So we have a few questions coming in. Amanda asks, does it help or hurt to write directly to the hiring manager or supervisor?
Yeah, good question. It depends a little bit on your industry, but it's typically not that helpful because the hiring manager is going to still need for you to have gone through a series of processes before they're able to make any decisions about you. So unless you have a friend who's a hiring manager, I would recommend you start more with those conversations with people who do what you would like to be doing in that role. And that's because of how hiring tends to work. So we tend to imagine that the decision makers are kind of making all of the choices around how the hiring is going to happen. And really they're not. What they're more likely to do is reach out to people they already know. So it's going to be usually their staff at the beginning, and see if people know anyone who can do this particular job. And once they ask their staff, if someone says, oh, I have a friend who does that, then they're going to go through that person and connect that way, not kind of a high up decision. So it tends to start really with people who have very similar sounding positions. It doesn't hurt certainly to talk to the hiring manager, but it's generally more helpful to talk to the people who share kind of job responsibilities with what you would hope to be doing, and to develop a really solid reputation with folks like that. And then they're going to recommend you to their friend who does that same work at a different organization, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it doesn't hurt to talk to the hiring manager directly, but most typically it's less beneficial than it is to talk to the people who kind of are at the level you would like to go in at. Of course, it doesn't hurt to know everyone in an organization, particularly if you're in a field where you've already begun to build up some credibility and a reputation. Or if it's a very small organization, but generally stick to the people who have jobs like what you want.
Great, thanks so much for that detailed answer. We've got a lot of really great questions coming in now.
Excellent.
The next one is, I am a fan of calendar blocking and have used it in the past, especially when working from home. I'm finding that it is not working now that my toddler is home with me 100%.
Right.
I've been waking up super early as I worked best in the mornings so that I can get work done before my toddler wakes up. What are other tips you have for working parents with children at home?
Yeah, this is a really, I'm getting this question a lot. And the truth is I don't have a concrete answer for you, but what most of the folks that I've been talking to are saying is what they're doing is taking very detailed notes on when their child, especially if it's a younger child like a toddler, needs the most attention, and when that child is more likely to be a little bit calmer. And so this is kind of a longer process. So it's sort of a day-to-day tracking process, but at a certain point, hopefully you have enough information that you actually can block out times when the child is more likely to be taking a nap or engaged with some kind of educational software, maybe a movie, that kind of thing. There's not a particularly easy answer for it, particularly if you don't have a spouse at home with you taking care of the child. If you do have a spouse, then what I would best practice, if you can do it, is for each of you to identify your most productive times and split the childcare duties so that you are doing more of the childcare work when it's not your best kind of worky time. And then what my next door neighbors are doing, they have a little guy who's I think 4 now, is they've decided that their parents are safe people for him because their parents have been very good at socially isolating themselves. So they're also asking the parents to share some childcare duties. It's not possible for everyone. And it's definitely not possible depending on the circumstances. But try starting with the tracking of when your child is the neediest and when the child is the quietest, and see if you can work around that. It's not an easy answer. I apologize for that. I don't actually have little ones at home, so this is me gleaning these tips from other folks. But you gotta be a parent first, because the little ones are gonna demand your attention a lot more than your boss. But just try a few of those. Let me know if it works. And if you have questions, feel free to connect with me via email, and we can definitely troubleshoot some things that might be more effective for you if those don't work.
Thank you. I'm going to skip around a little bit because Amanda had a clarification for her question. What she really wanted to know was, does it help or hurt to write directly to the hiring person or supervisor or director after applying to an open position on their team?
Gotcha. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. It doesn't really do a whole lot in general. Truthfully, it doesn't hurt anything. And if it's a very small organization, it could certainly increase your odds of getting at least an interview. But most places have a specific process that they need to adhere to once the applications are in. So in general, it doesn't help that much. And the caveat there would be if you already know that particular person, like if the hiring manager is the person who told you to apply, then definitely keep those lines of communication open. Otherwise, I would say it's not going to help you that much, although you could certainly reach out to that person and offer to connect on LinkedIn after you send in your application, just so you can kind of get a sense of who they hire and what they're looking for in a candidate, and you can tailor your interview questions a little bit based on what you find.
Thank you. The next question is regarding resume formatting.
Yeah.
The person asks, I know you said to keep it simple, but I feel like there's been a rise in popularity with more designed resumes, not just black and white. First is my education, then my work experience, and it's just one page, but with sidebars, key qualifications, etc. Whereas what I learned when I was first entering the job market was that more flashy resumes were looked down on. If you know what I mean, what's your take on these?
Yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. And the truth is that a lot of this is going to depend on your industry. So if you are looking for a job in a field that tends to be very, very creative, architecture, for instance, some areas within marketing, then you certainly can go for a sort of flashier looking resume. The biggest concern from me is whether or not the applicant tracking systems will be able to read it. And so that's when you get like the sidebars and things like that. And honestly, I tend to think that a lot of that stuff makes the resume look really busy. I go for clarity. And what I found when I was actually doing some interviewing with people when I was at a university and I was on interviewing teams, what I found was that often the fancier formatting was hiding a lack or trying to hide a lack of experience. So if you are going into a very creative industry, do feel free to be a little bit fancier on the document, but make sure that what you're really putting forward first and foremost is content. And to the one-page thing, let me just give you my little perspective there. So a couple of years ago, a resume writing service called Resume Go got really curious about whether a one-page resume was really all it was cracked up to be. And so they called in about 400 people in hiring positions and did a very thorough study of it and found that across the board, these people preferred the two-page resume. They preferred it slightly less for entry-level positions, but they still preferred it, and they strongly preferred it for higher-level positions. So don't feel stuck to one page. And if you are in a field like academia or medicine, obviously you're going to have a crazy long CV that has chapters. So yeah, if you're in a very creative industry, go a little bit fancier. But if you can figure out beforehand what the application software is, that's going to help you determine whether or not you should go fancy.
Thanks, Emily. The next question, are there any good websites or books that you recommend to learn to be more productive?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, there are a lot of books out there around productivity. I'm not familiar with them, so I can't speak to them. But I would probably, honestly, if you are struggling, spend a little bit of time online Googling things like productivity hacks and, you know, how to be productive and things like that. For me, it's really come down to those shorter bursts of things. I tend to get my energy from interacting with people. And since I'm not doing very much of that right now, what I'm doing is I'm scheduling smaller blocks of time. So more like 35 or 45 minutes of kind of burst productivity with a break in between. Other than that, I would say do that, the productivity seeker app, the process that walks you through figuring out your most productive time and see if that helps any. But I can't speak to any particular websites or books, so my apologies for that.
Thanks, Emily. Next question, what are your thoughts on the T-style cover letter?
Yeah, the T-style cover letter, if you're not familiar with it, it's a style of cover letter in which your writing kind of forms a negative space T. So you have kind of an introductory paragraph where you just say who you are and kind of what you learned about the position. And then instead of a traditional second, third paragraph, what you have is two columns that's on one side you seek and on one side I offer. And this again is going to depend a lot on your industry. I don't love it for things like counseling, social work, things like that that are warm and fuzzy because the nature of those letters is very kind of cut and dried. But in a lot of business circles, they're a really great way to really demonstrate you've asked for this qualification, I have this much of it. So it's a really good way for some particular industries for you to demonstrate that you've really got these pieces of experience and that you are kind of looking to connect your experience with what they're seeking. The trick there is don't skip anything really important. So if they have a required skill and you don't have it, you're not sneaking anything past them by not putting it in your you seek bullet. But you can certainly speak around it. So if you have done something that looks very much like what they're seeking, but has a different name, if they want, for instance, a very particular piece of software and you don't have that piece of experience, but you have something that looks very similar to it, you can absolutely put that in instead. So if you have a follow-up to that, if you want to tell me the industry or segment of work you're looking in, I can speak a little bit more carefully to it. But if you like the T format, probably people in your industry do as well.
Thanks, Emily. Before we get to the next question, we have a comment from Daniel regarding books about productivity. He recommends David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. So that might be a good resource to check out. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel.
All right, our next question is from May. Do you recommend weeding LinkedIn for more within your industry or desired industry, or keeping your connections and increase further into the industry you're in or interested in?
Yeah, I recommend not necessarily weeding it, but spending more time in the industry you're interested in getting into, and really spending a greater piece of your effort in meeting new people, virtually meeting people in the new industry. So you're really growing your connections there. You don't necessarily want to cull old connections because LinkedIn is a place where the length of your profile doesn't matter. People will look at what they're interested in looking at. And so you can have that piece of history within your profile, but you'll want to spend a little bit more time and effort on the new folks and kind of getting out in front of them in various ways. And with that, if you are looking to go into a new industry, spend some time figuring out how you would like to be putting yourself forward on your LinkedIn profile, particularly if you've lost a job. You can also then, you can go back into your profile and redefine yourself, kind of give yourself the title of something you are seeking next. Of course, you can't give yourself any title that is legally protected, can't call yourself a surgeon unless you're actually a surgeon. But if there's no licensure or legal protection for a title, you can absolutely call yourself that, or you can call yourself, you know, a job seeker with skills in X, Y, and Z. So that time and effort is going to go really towards the new field without feeling like you have to get rid of anyone in the old field.
Thanks, Emily. We have another comment. This is from Amelia Hagan, who will be doing the webinar with us in May on personal
Fabulous.
branding. But she mentions that in the AJET job listings Facebook group, there's a file, it's a Google Doc, which is filled with job listings and a new tab with Jets who've signed up to be mentors for other Jets.
Oh, great.
This can be a decent way to start reaching out to people for informational interviews, questions, etc. Thank you for that tip, Amelia. I actually was not aware of this, so I
wasn't either. That's very cool. Thank you.
Our next question from Daniel is, outside of informational interviews, in this environment, do you see time more effectively spent building skills or applying for positions, broadly speaking?
Broadly speaking, yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think it's going to depend a little bit on the kinds of skills. I think what people are finding is that concentration is harder right now. So I wouldn't necessarily be focused on building very high level skills unless you are just a person who's very intellectually wired. So for instance, I don't think now is the time to take up your Mandarin studies in the hopes of becoming fluent, just because so many people are having so much of a struggle to focus on harder things. Again, if you have a very intellectual bent, that might be your sweet spot there. But generally, what I would recommend is that you spend a little bit more time applying, because you can really customize your resume for the different positions that you're finding, and really craft your cover letter very thoughtfully. And you can also reach out to the people who are your references and talk them through the kinds of things that you're interested in applying for. And what you'll find is that if they have a bigger bandwidth right now as well, they might also mention some things that you've forgotten, or they might help you out with some tips on things like skills that you tend to underplay. We all sort of underplay the things that are really natural to us, the things that we're the best at. And so this might be a really good time for you to reach out to those references and say, you know, I'm interested in applying for this position. What do you think? What kinds of things would you say if they were to reach out to you as a reference for me? And see if you can really kind of figure out what those skills are and play those up as well.
Great, thanks, Emily. Dustin asks, what is the standard for following up if you don't hear back?
Yeah. Good question, Dustin. So because people are struggling more with time management and things like that in these here times, you have more leeway. So the typical kind of protocol for it, what I normally recommend anyway, is that you give it in the realm of a week between contacts. So, you know, reach out to someone. If you don't hear back within about a week, reach out again. I'm giving it a bit of a shorter window given this particular situation, just because it feels like we all have a little bit more flexibility around that. So I would say if you reach out to someone and you haven't heard back in say 3 business days, reach out again. And if you can, reach out a different way. So if you have access to that person's, say, phone number and email, make the initial outreach via email. And if you haven't heard back in a few days, make sure you know their time zone, so you're not calling them at 4 in the morning, but reach out to them on the phone later on, like 3 days later, and just say, hey, I'm following up. I sent you an email a few days ago, really kind of feeling at loose ends, and I would love to chat with you about this because I would really like to start working again. Or if it's for an informational interview, same kind of idea there. So I'm clustering them a little bit closer together, and I'm encouraging people to do more outreaches. I normally say 3, go for more than 3. I think 5 in this climate is perfectly fine. That final one, decide however many feels appropriate to you, but that final one, you want to say something like, you must be really busy. I totally understand. My concentration is a little bit shattered right now too, but I'm really excited about working in this field. Do you have anyone else you think I should talk to instead of you? And so you've given them a gracious out, but you've also hopefully given yourself a new contact. If that person can respond just to that piece of it, you're still a step ahead.
Thanks. And now going back to resumes,
Yeah.
what percentage of employers use ATS systems?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it depends on the size of the industry, but what most people are saying is that it's upwards of 85%. Very, very small companies are generally not using them. And some larger companies are using better systems that have things, a little bit more things like fuzzy logic so that they can actually extrapolate your meaning from things. And some newer, more flexible applicant tracking systems, instead of weeding through for keywords, will just ask rule out questions. You can tell this has happened if you complete an application and it says at the end, or sometimes at the beginning, do you have a bachelor's degree? Do you have at least 2 years of experience? Are you willing to relocate to Minnesota? Those questions are the rule out questions that the applicant tracking system is using instead of looking very specifically for keywords and formatting in the document. And you can actually, if you want, you can poke around a little bit online and figure out what kinds of applicant tracking systems exist. But broadly speaking, there's the old clunky one that looks for those keywords and reads your formatting. And then there's the newer, fancier kind that only asks rule out questions that are determined by people who are doing the hiring at the organization. But assume you're going to get them, because it's better to have the keywords really well matched than not to. And it gives your human audience also an easier way to gauge if they're scoring you, for instance, on points. They can give you more points if you've used similar language to what they've used, and they don't have to do any kind of thinking about, does this mean that? So assume that it's going to be that. And let me know if you have other questions around it. And definitely use JobLink. It's not JobLink, JobScan. It's a really great tool that will help you think in those concrete terms. Jobscan.co. And I don't know why it's CO.
Great resource, though.
Yeah.
So next question, Baiba asks, I cleaned up my resume and cut 2 pages, but I'm in academia and feel that I've now left out a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
What would be a page limit for a professor?
There's not really a page limit for faculty positions. So good news, bad news, right? I have worked with faculty who have their CVs actually broken into chapters. So there's not a page limit for faculty, and standard practice is just to list every single thing. And so you can go semester by semester if you want, but you're fine if it's 5 pages, 10. I worked with someone who came out of journalism and was teaching journalism. And so he had all of his published articles in there. And his was, last time I spoke with him, which was probably 3 years ago, his was 30 some pages long. So if you are in academia, go crazy. Medicine is a little bit like that as well.
Great. So still on the resume questions, May asks, if a resume is organized in rows and columns with a table, will the ATS not read it? For example, the grid lines are invisible, but just there to keep it aligned.
Yeah, typically the clunky old-fashioned ones will not be able to read those. The other reason I don't really like the table formatting is that it's kind of limiting. And I think it winds up, I think it looks like a table, even if you can't see the grid lines. That's me. If you love how it looks, you certainly can't opt to use it, but do be aware that those older, clunkier applicant tracking systems are probably not going to be able to read it. Some can. Again, I just err on the side of caution with these things, because, you know, better to assume that the clunkiest thing is going to happen and have troubleshot it than to get not considered because it couldn't figure out your formatting.
So regarding the ATS, you said that it's good to have an address, at least city and zip code. Is it okay to just put your city and zip code rather than a full address? I have heard about some privacy concerns, and some people don't feel comfortable including their full address on a resume. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the full address on a resume for a variety of reasons. Believe it or not, there's actually discrimination that can happen at that level. If people know that where you live, for instance, is in a poorer neighborhood, there might even be some assumptions made around that. So you're under no obligation to put the full address if you don't want to. And in fact, some people are kind of anxious about even zip codes because, again, there are poorer zip codes and richer zip codes. And if that's a concern, you can just put city and state in. I like the zip code because I think it narrows things down a little bit more, makes it seem a little bit more, I don't know, more imaginable, I guess, to the recruiters. But you're absolutely under no obligation to put the full address in there. I've tended to keep mine on back when I was writing regular resumes, just because I liked how it looked in terms of balance, but there's no need for you to do it. So it's absolutely your call. And I totally understand the privacy concerns. And especially in times like this where so many people are online and I think there's so much more hacking going on. You're absolutely fine and within your rights if you just put city and state or city, state, zip.
Thanks, Emily. Do you know if higher education likes and or uses the T-style cover letter?
Yeah, things that are very results oriented in higher ed do. So for instance, admissions, which tends to have a lot of measurables, will tend to like the T-style, whereas say the University Counseling Center, not so much. So even within higher ed, it depends a lot on the kind of position that you're applying for. But I'll just go back to what I said earlier. If you love it, if you think this is the most brilliant thing ever and it really demonstrates your points, then chances are really good that your audience also thinks that, because we tend to select into fields where we're a little bit more like-minded with our colleagues than things that are very different. So like if you think it's great and it's brilliant and you love it, then you're probably not looking to teach social work, for example, or to become a social worker. I knew a social worker once who just hated all bullet points and didn't even want them in resumes. So I always told his class, look, don't put bullet points in your resumes for the assignment. But if you like them, you can put them back in when you're actually applying for the jobs. But social work, because it's such a warm profession where the sort of warmth of your communication was key, they just happen to hate it. So again, if you love it, if you think it really demonstrates your point really well, your colleagues probably do as well.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions. And all right, first I wanna add a comment that somebody has put regarding this, what we were just talking about. They said that they've been in higher ed for nearly a decade and have gotten a lot of first and second interviews using that T-style cover letter.
Excellent.
I also have two questions going back to the question about addresses, and yeah. I'm gonna kind of lump them together. But first question is, for your resume, if you're in a small town adjacent to a larger one, could you just list that larger one? For example, New York, New York, or I guess in the DC area, it would be, you know, Washington, DC instead of Virginia. The other question, sorry, go ahead. And then I'll ask the next question.
Okay. So I generally with resumes, I really encourage people to err on the side of extreme truthfulness. So you don't want to get caught in anything that kind of seems like a lie, but you could, for instance, put suburbs of New York City. Something like that instead of the specific town name. But one of the things that has often worked against people is things that don't feel untruthful to them, but strike the employer that way. So I would generally say put in the small town, but you can then, for instance, in the cover letter, say, as you can see, I live in this small town, but it's only a 5-minute drive from the larger city, or whatever you want to say like that. Or like I said, you can put something like the suburbs, whatever makes sense to you. But yeah, generally on the resume, you're going to want to err on the side of honesty and caution.
Thank you. And then again, related to this question of addresses, we have a comment/question. I've heard strong caution against using addresses and even phone numbers, since they have area codes, when trying to find jobs in other parts of the country. For example, you're from rural Indiana and want to get a job in San Francisco. Since a lot of places don't want to deal with relocation and they already have a large pool of people in the area that could be qualified, what is your take on this?
Yeah, so the area code for the phone doesn't really matter much anymore, because since people tend to keep their original cell phone numbers, that's not a concern. So you'll find plenty of people living in any given metro area who have area codes from totally different cities. So that's not a concern. Generally, I would say put a piece of your physical address on the resume anyway, because typically, if an employer is only interested in hiring from a specific region, say they're only interested in hiring people from the West Coast, they will post the job as regionally as possible. So most job boards have the option for you to post it nationally or regionally, and sometimes even just locally. And so if the employer has said they're going to post it nationally, then that means that they're looking for a larger pool of candidates. And so you're not likely to have that work against you. And since in this particular climate, employers are not flying people out for interviews, if there is a physical relocation that needs to happen, they're either going to pay for it or they're not. And what employers that can't afford any relocation bonuses will often do is just say that up front. So you know that that's the case. And then that just means that if you get the offer and decide to take it, you're on the hook for the actual moving expenses. Some places are trying to be a little bit more supportive in terms of giving some kind of benefits for relocation, but often that's just something like helping you find people who can assist with housing in the new location, as opposed to actually shelling out money for the relocation process itself. It's more of a concern when there is a round of interviews that are in person and they might fly people out. But that said, even in really kind of shoestring budget kinds of organizations, if they've decided they want to do a national search, they will almost always have set aside some money to fly people in. And then in the course of the interview, if they're talking to you about kind of why you're looking to move, just have a really thoughtful answer about why you're looking to move. And it could be as simple as, you know, I have family in the area and I'd like to be closer to them, or whatever it is. You could just say, you know, I'm so enthusiastic about this position that I'm willing to make the move, even though it's an unfamiliar part of town or part of the world for me.
Great. Well, I'm sure we could keep asking you questions all day, but we're going to have to finish with this final question. In your experience, assuming you're not entry level anymore, how flexible is the master's degree required, not preferred? I have a lot of experience for a lot of positions, but feel discouraged by seeing this line a lot since I only have a relevant BA.
Yeah, generally, and first of all, it sucks when you feel really discouraged like that. So just let me acknowledge that. If they're saying required, generally it really means required. And so what I would encourage you to do is, if you're seeing that a lot on positions, see if you can find out more about positions like that before they get posted. What you're running into is that by the time it's officially posted, they've put in all of the restrictions that they can because they've already exhausted their pool of known candidates. So if you are looking in a specific segment or a particular industry, figure out what the professional organizations are for that segment or industry. Join those professional associations on LinkedIn. You generally can do that on LinkedIn for free. See if they have maybe a Facebook page as well. You don't necessarily have to join the organization at the real level because that comes with membership dues and, you know, those kinds of things. But you can typically join online for free, and you can begin to have a reputation for a communicator within that particular field on those social media platforms. And then when those jobs come open before they're officially posted, when the employers are looking more for their sort of human sides of the connections, they're more likely to reach out to you and say, hey, we've got this coming up. Can we talk about your experience? So you can often nip that in the bud sort of before the posting becomes official, because generally if it says required, they're pretty serious about required. If it says preferred, you're fine, go ahead and apply. And then really play up the experience you have that's relevant to the position. But in most cases, if you get a breakdown like that, if you get required experience versus preferred experience, the required is most typically a hard rule out. But if you have more specific questions on that, please reach out to me because I'm really glad to talk through it with you because it is a very real frustration. And I can definitely help you figure out some of those networking shortcuts so that you don't feel so discouraged by the process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for this really interesting and informative webinar. For those of you who are listening, if you enjoyed this, Emily has done 2 other webinars for USJETAA, and you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel or on our website. She has done a webinar on how to find a career, and then she was one of 3 speakers on You've Finished the JET program, Now What? That might be useful to some of you. We also have another career related person, Camaris Hofalo, who has done two webinars for us, one on LinkedIn basics for JETs and one on resume advice for JETs. That's really great as well. And then again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have 2 upcoming webinars, one on May 14th on personal branding with Amelia Hagen, and one on May 27th on marketing your JET experience with Ryan Paw. When we send out the recording of this webinar, we'll be sure to link to you the registration for those so that you have that, as well as information about some of the webinars that Emily has done in the past. She also has a handout that I will send out to you all as well. Well, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you everybody for taking an hour of your day to join us. We hope this was helpful to you, and I would definitely be interested in knowing your thoughts on this timing. We typically do our webinars in the evenings, so if you liked this time slot or if you hated it even, please let us know. But anyway, thank you, Emily, and
Thank
to
you.
everybody else, please, I hope you and your families stay happy and healthy during this really challenging time. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.